Negative K, nothing further, just see a cabbie on the corner.
In the winter of 1957, a college student had stumbled upon the remains of a young boy in the woods near Philadelphia. He reported this gruesome discovery to the police. The boy was found badly beaten and laid to rest inside an old bassinet box. His identity was unknown. Several people had came forward with information relating to this case, but the police were not able to verify anyone's testimony. One woman, Martha, claimed that her abusive mother brought the boy. Under their roof, he was subjected to the physical and sexual abuse. What made the police take interest in Martha's story was her knowledge of details that had not been released to the public. She claimed that shortly before the boy was beaten to death, he had ate baked beans, which corroborated with the autopsy. She also claimed that he was bathed before his death, which matched the coroner's finding of water-pruned fingers. Though Martha's testimony seemed to match the evidence, her substantial history of mental illness made her an unreliable witness. Therefore, everything was discredited. Another lead had come in from a psychic who had accurately described a foster home near where the boy had been found, without ever having seen it. Remington Bristow, an employee at the examiner's office, had followed the psychic's directions to the foster house. Inside, he discovered a bassinet matching the description of the bassinet box the boy was found in. He also found blankets, similar to the one that was wrapped around the boy's body. But because there was no real incriminating evidence against the foster parents, Bristow's findings were dismissed and discredited as well. 65 years have passed, and the case of the boy in the box has gone cold. Facial reconstruction technology has provided mock images of what the boy might have looked like alive, but no one has ever come forward to claim him. DNA and dental testing has also been attempted, with no success thus far. Therefore, the identity of the boy in the box remains unknown to this day, and the case goes unsolved. In the fall of 1965, Fred and Edwina Rogers were living in Houston, Texas, along with their son, Charles. The family had mostly kept to themselves in their quiet, reclusive neighborhood, especially given Charles' apprehensive and antisocial behavior. In fact, many of the neighbors within the neighborhood were not even aware that Charles had lived at home with his parents. He had left the house each day before dawn and didn't return until well after nightfall. When a family member hadn't heard from the Rogers in several days, the family member had called the Houston Police Department for a welfare check on his elderly aunt and uncle. The policemen were unable to locate Fred and Edwina, but they had noticed food sitting on the dining room table through the window. They gained access to the house, and they eventually had opened the fridge and noticed numerous packages of meat neatly stacked on top of one another. Then they noticed it. There were 2 human heads in the vegetable bin. When the officers saw this, they backed up quickly. They called in for backup, and additional officers were sent and arrived on the scene. They all saw this stomach-turning scene, and they slowly removed the packages full of dismembered body parts from the refrigerator. The remains were that of Fred and Edwina Rogers. The police deduced that Edwina had been brutally beaten and shot, while Fred suffered forceful trauma to the head. His eyes had been gouged out, his ears were chopped off, and his genitalia had been removed. The couple's innards had been flushed down the toilet, and Charles, their son, was nowhere to be found. Naturally, Charles was the prime suspect in this heinous crime. Seemingly enough, he vanished off the face of the earth. Although the police were able to collect circumstantial pieces of evidence against him, Charles Rogers was never found, and this case had gone cold. It's 1977, the summertime. 3 young Girl Scouts staying at an Oklahoma campsite were raped and murdered. The girls, Lori, Michelle, and Doris, were between the ages of 8 and 10. About 2 months before the murders, a camp counselor found a disturbing note in their belongings. The culprit had promised to murder 3 children at the camp. Knowing that the young campers enjoyed telling scary stories around the campfire, the camp counselor, who will remain unnamed, had dismissed the threatening note as nothing more than a harmless prank. A decision this camp counselor would come to regret. Very early in the morning of June 13th, the girls' bodies were found in their sleeping bags, out of the trail leading to the camp showers. The only evidence that the killer left behind was a red flashlight and a bloody footprint. The prime suspect of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders was Gene Leroy Hart, an escaped convict. Hart had been raised for about a mile from Camp Scott, and at the time of the murders, he was at large after escaping from prison, where he had been serving time for burglary, kidnapping, and rape. A local jury acquitted Hart of the crime, citing a lack of evidence. However, Oklahoma police considered this case solved. But, to this day, no one knows if Gene Leroy Hart had got away with murder, or if the true killer was somewhere else entirely. Regardless, the girl's killer never saw justice, and this case has gone cold. This American serial killer was active in the greater New Orleans area between 1918 and 1919. The majority of the murderer's victims were from the Italian immigrant community, and they were killed brutally with an axe that belonged to them. The killer would access his victims' homes by removing a panel on their back door. This would then give the killer access, and he would murder them, either with a straight razor or an axe. The brutal serial killer attacked at least 12 people total, most of which were women. In March of 1919, the unidentified killer had sent a deranged letter from hell, where he had described himself as invisible. The note had read, "Even as the ether that surrounds your earth, I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." In the letter, the Axeman had also stated the date and the time of his next planned murder, and he suggested that the only way to stop him was to play jazz music. In response, the entire city filled its buildings and streets with the music's sound that night, and no one was murdered. The axe murderer would strike 3 more times before his activity eventually ceased. Today, the story of the Axeman has been brought back to life, thanks to a similar character in the TV show known as American Horror Story. Even today, over 100 years later, we've yet to find a murder suspect for this case. Therefore, this case remains cold. The year is 1982. A 12-year-old girl in Chicago, Illinois had passed away shortly after ingesting an extra-strength Tylenol. The same day, a man died in a hospital after taking the same pill. 2 of his family members had followed. Over the course of the next few weeks, more seemingly healthy people within the city limits of Chicago had dropped dead, and the only thing that they had in common was taking the extra-strength Tylenol shortly before their untimely death. As numerous bottles were recalled by Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer, it was discovered that many of the extra-strength Tylenol pills had been laced with potassium cyanide. Potassium cyanide is a compound. It's a colorless salt that is a highly toxic chemical that interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen. Exposure to potassium cyanide can be rapidly fatal. Once this information was made public, Johnson & Johnson had issued numerous advertisements and warnings to customers to avoid the product. Johnson & Johnson had began to work on a triple-sealed package that would prevent tampering. James William Lewis of New York City had contacted Johnson & Johnson, claiming that he was responsible for tampering with the bottles and filling the capsules with potassium cyanide. He had demanded $1 million in exchange for him to stop. He was arrested for the crime, and although he wasn't found guilty, he was still imprisoned for extortion. Even after Johnson & Johnson fortified their Tylenol bottles against tampering, the widespread news of what had happened here in Chicago prompted crimes of a similar nature all around the country. Several more people died from potassium cyanide poison found in the over-the-counter medication. The Chicago Tylenol Murders is one of the few true crimes to spark real change in the country. The quality control of pharmaceuticals increased tenfold, as did the security of their packaging. Although the Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't have enough evidence to convict anyone of the crime, it is widely believed that James William Lewis and his wife were indeed responsible, yet this case has gone cold. An English-born Australian serial killer, John Wayne Glover, was known for preying on elderly women, including the widow of artist Will Ashton. Over the span of 14 months between the years of 1989 and 1990, Glover murdered 6 elderly women after brutally attacking them. At times, he would simply use his fist to attack his victims, but with others, he used blunt objects like hammers, or he would use his victims' pantyhose or other instruments. Many of his victims were simply women he saw walking past him on the street, with whom he struck up casual conversation with. In addition to attacking and murdering those 6 women, Glover was also accused of molesting and sexually assaulting several other elderly women. At his trial, a psychologist had noted that while Glover was sane, he had a severe personality disorder, which may or may not have been connected to his turbulent relationships with his mother and his mother-in-law. After being found guilty and sentenced to prison, Glover had killed himself in 2005. But days before he died, he handed his last visitor a picture that he had drawn featuring 2 trees and the number 9. Supposedly, 9 is the true number of the murders Glover was responsible for, not the 6 for which he was convicted. But that's speculation, and for those other 3 unfortunate victims, those cases have gone cold.